A gambler jumped off a Royal Caribbean cruise ship with $14,600 strapped to his chest after losing $16,000 in the casino. Rescued by jet skiers, he now faces a federal crime charge. The Caribbean sun poured down on the rhapsody of the seas, turning the water into a sheet of sparkling glass. The cruise ship cut through the waves like a palace on the ocean. Passengers leaned over railings with cameras, drinks in hand, capturing the horizon. Steel drums played near the pool deck. Bartenders poured rum cocktails, and the smell of grilled shrimp floated in the air. It was supposed to be a trip filled with laughter, leisure, and luxury. Among the hundreds of smiling tourists, one man carried a different kind of excitement in his chest. His name was J. Xander Omar Gonzalez Diaz. He wore casual clothes, but his eyes betrayed a restless hunger. He was not here just for the pools or the beaches. His paradise was waiting below deck. At night, when the decks grew quieter, the casino came alive. Neon lights reflected off polished tables, dice rolled across green felt, and every win was followed by the triumphant sound of clinking coins. The casino had a pulse, a rhythm that called to those who believed fortune was only one hand away. Jay was among the first to walk through its doors. He carried thick wads of cash, his hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from anticipation. Dealers greeted him with practiced smiles. The air was heavy with perfume, cigar smoke, and the thrill of risk. To Jay, this was not a vacation game. This was opportunity. His first bets felt like fire. The roulette wheel spun and the ball landed in his favor. Chips stacked on the table, rising like small towers. He grinned, ordering another drink, clinking glasses with strangers who cheered his streak. The slot machines sang their hypnotic jingles, flashing screens promising even greater rewards. In those early hours, Jay felt invincible. The Caribbean was his kingdom and the casino his crown. He thought, this is the trip where I double my money. This is where I finally get ahead. Every win made the dream feel real. But luck is a cruel companion. The same roulette wheel that had once landed on his number began to betray him. The dealer's smile never changed, but the cards stopped falling in his favor. Chips disappeared faster than they stacked. He chased losses with bigger bets, telling himself the tide would turn. Drinks blurred his judgment, the neon glow made time meaningless, and the hours slipped away. The strangers who once clapped him on the back drifted off to their cabins, leaving him hunched over the table, eyes fixed on the spinning wheel. By the time he looked down at his chips, most of them were gone. When the lights of the casino dimmed for closing, Jay stumbled out with only a sick feeling in his stomach. The thrill had curdled into despair. $16,000 gone. The number rang in his ears, repeating like a curse. He leaned against the railing on deck, staring out at the endless dark water. Waves slapped against the hull as if mocking him. He still had nearly $15,000 in cash tucked away, but instead of comfort, it felt like a burden. He thought about debts, about customs waiting in Puerto Rico, about the possibility of losing even more. On the surface, the ship was a floating paradise. For Jay, it had become a prison of his own making. The sea stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving, whispering temptations he was not ready to admit. The gamble had only just begun. The next morning, the rhapsody of the seas glided smoothly towards San Juan. The pool deck was alive with sunscreen, laughter, and piña coladas. But Jay sat alone, slouched in a deck chair, staring into the distance. The salty air stung his lungs. His head was heavy, not from the ocean breeze, but from the weight of what he had lost. $16,000. The number clung to him like seaweed, sticky and impossible to shake. He replayed every losing hand in his mind. He saw the wheel spin in slow motion, the ball clattering into the wrong pocket again and again. He heard the hollow thud of chips sliding across the table to someone else. Passengers laughed around him, but all Jay heard was the ringing echo of his failure. In his cabin, the reality was worse. A letter sat on the desk from Royal Caribbean. It was blunt, stamped with the cruise line seal. Outstanding balance, $16,710.24, settlement required. The words punched him harder than any wave. He owed nearly $17,000, and it was tied almost exclusively to casino and gaming charges. His hands shook as he stuffed the letter into his bag as if hiding it could erase the debt. He still had cash, nearly $15,000, tucked in a waterproof pouch. It should have been his safety net. Instead, it felt like a ticking bomb. He imagined walking through customs in San Juan, forced to declare the money. He pictured agents seizing it, taxing it, leaving him with nothing. In his mind, the walls of the cabin closed in. He could not breathe. By afternoon, the ship was docked. Tourists lined up to disembark for shopping and sightseeing. Jay walked the upper deck instead, pacing back and forth like a man on trial. He clutched the pouch under his shirt, sweat soaking through the fabric. He leaned on the railing, staring at the waves below. The water shimmered with sunlight, a moving mirror of blue and white. To most, it was beauty. To him, it was escape. The thought came quietly at first. What if I just go into the water? No customs, no taxes, no questions. Just me and my cash. A crazy idea. Yet the longer he stood there, the more it grew roots in his mind. Passengers nearby pointed at the skyline of San Juan, taking selfies and laughing. Jay did not hear them. His eyes locked on the sea, hypnotized by its rhythm. The pouch of money pressed against his chest like a stone. His breathing quickened. His heart pounded like a drum. He thought of the debt, the letter, the shame. He thought of explaining to his family. He thought of the casino dealers who smiled while taking his chips. And then the thought turned into a decision. He swung one leg over the railing. His hands gripped the cold steel. For a moment, the world stood still. The city shimmered in the distance. The wind carried faint music from the pool deck. Then, without hesitation, he jumped. The crowd gasped. A scream rang out from behind him. Someone shouted, "Man overboard!" The calm afternoon shattered. Jay plunged into the Caribbean, the cold water hitting him like a wall. His body thrashed, bubbles filling his vision. He surfaced, coughing, clutching the pouch of cash tight against his chest. The ship towered above him, passengers leaning over railings, pointing and shouting. In that instant, Jay felt a rush of freedom mixed with terror. He had escaped the ship, but the ocean was merciless. Waves slapped his face, his arms burned as he tried to stay afloat. The pouch weighed him down like an anchor. Onboard alarms blared, crew members rushed to the edge, radios in hand. The floating palace he had gambled his life away on now looked down at him like a giant judge. The gamble had left the casino. Now it was between him and the sea. The water was colder than Jay expected. It swallowed him whole, pulling at his clothes and tugging on the pouch strapped to his chest. He kicked wildly, his arms cutting through the waves, but every movement felt slower, heavier. The pouch clung to him like a weight, dragging him under. Above, the rhapsody of the seas loomed like a skyscraper, its decks crowded with passengers leaning over the railings. Shouts of "Man overboard" echoed across the water. Crew members pointed and scrambled, radios buzzing with urgency. But the ship was too massive to stop quickly. Jay was on his own. Salt burned his throat as he coughed and fought to stay afloat. His thoughts spun in panic. He had leapt to escape, but now the ocean threatened to claim him entirely. Just when his arms began to ache with exhaustion, he heard the faint roar of engines. Two jet skiers, tourists out for an afternoon ride near the harbor, spotted him flailing in the water. At first, they thought it was a prank, a daredevil stunt pulled by some thrill-seeking passenger. But the desperation in Jay's eyes told a different story. They circled closer, their machines chopping the water into spray. "Grab on!" one shouted over the roar. Jay lunged at the side of the jet ski, nearly tipping it, clutching with trembling hands. With effort, they hauled him aboard, his soaked clothes dripping, his pouch clutched to his chest like it was his last lifeline. The jet ski sped toward the shore, carrying a man who had just jumped from paradise into disaster. The shoreline of San Juan came into view. People gathered on the docks, pointing and whispering as the jet skiers approached. Jay's face was pale, his hair plastered to his forehead, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Still, his arms wrapped tightly around the pouch. He refused to let go, even when the rescuers urged him to drop it for balance. When the jet ski glided to a stop at the pier, Customs and Border Protection officers were already waiting. They had been alerted by the ship and were ready for him. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised, recording the bizarre sight of a drenched cruise passenger being dragged off a jet ski under armed escort. Agents pulled Jay to his feet. His legs wobbled as they unzipped the pouch strapped to his chest. Inside, stacks of bills sat wrapped in rubber bands, dripping from seawater but unmistakably real. One officer began counting out loud, his voice flat and steady. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. The crowd leaned forward, whispering in disbelief. The counting continued until the final tally was announced. $14,600. Gasps rippled through the bystanders. Some muttered that he must have stolen it. Others guessed it was drug money. Nobody believed the simple truth that it was his, and he was terrified of losing it to customs. Jay's chest tightened as officers snapped handcuffs onto his wrists. His soaked clothes clung to him, his eyes darting between the agents and the crowd. The pouch was sealed in an evidence bag, the bills flashing like a symbol of both his desperation and his downfall. As they led him up the dock, whispers followed. "That's the gambler. He lost 16 grand in the casino. He jumped ship with all that cash." The irony hit him like another wave. He had jumped to escape debt and fear, but instead he had leapt straight into the hands of the law. The gamble had left the casino, but the stakes were higher than ever. At the dock in San Juan, Jay was drenched, cuffed, and shivering. Federal agents escorted him into a small room near the harbor, a plain white space with a single metal table and a buzzing light above. His pouch of money sat sealed in a clear evidence bag on the table. The bills inside looked almost alive, floating in the moisture left from the sea. Special Agent Gabriel Santiago of Homeland Security Investigations walked in, placing a thin stack of papers on the table. He stared at Jay for a long moment before speaking. "You jumped off a cruise ship. You had over $10,000 in cash. You did not report it. That is a federal crime." Jay shifted in his chair, his wet clothes clinging to his skin. He swallowed hard and said in Spanish, his voice barely steady, "I did not want to report the currency because I thought I was going to be taxed. I thought they would take it from me." The agent opened his file. He slid a document across the table. Printed in bold letters at the top was "Outstanding Balance." Beneath it, a total $16,710.24. The charges were almost exclusively casino and gaming expenses. Blackjack, roulette, poker. It was all there in black and white. Santiago leaned forward. "You owe this to Royal Caribbean. You ran up the bill in the casino, and when the ship docked, you tried to run. Do you know how this looks? A man in debt, with cash strapped to his chest, jumping overboard." Jay shook his head quickly. "It was not like that. I was scared. I thought they would ask questions about the money. I thought they would take everything." But his words sounded hollow. On the page, it looked like a man who lost his fortune in a casino and tried to swim away with the rest. An officer entered, carrying another folder. He placed it on the table and read aloud. "You are charged with failing to report the transport of monetary instruments over $10,000 into the United States." The words rang in Jay's ears. He had expected trouble, maybe a fine or angry letters from the cruise line. But a federal charge was different. It meant prison, records, and headlines. Santiago asked calmly, "Do you understand what that means?" Jay nodded weakly, his eyes fixed on the pouch of cash. The same money he had jumped into the sea to protect was now evidence against him. Meanwhile, reporters swarmed outside. The story spread fast. A man lost $16,000 gambling, then leapt into the ocean with a fortune strapped to his chest. Cameras flashed, locals gathered, and the scene grew into a spectacle. Royal Caribbean released only one sentence to the press. "As this is an ongoing investigation, we are working with authorities and have no further comment." It was clean, professional, and distant. But among passengers still on board, rumors flew. Some swore they had seen him winning big before it all collapsed. Others whispered he had stolen the money. Everyone agreed on one thing: the ship had never seen drama like this. Inside the interrogation room, Jay sat hunched over, his hands cuffed, his voice cracking. He whispered, "I just wanted to keep my money. I did not want to lose more. That is all." But no one in the room believed it was that simple. To the agents, he was a man who gambled, lost, and then risked his life to avoid responsibility. To the cruise line, he was a debtor who owed them thousands. To the law, he was now a criminal facing federal charges. The irony cut deeper than the ocean waves he had jumped into. He thought escaping the ship would free him from debt and fear. Instead, it dragged him into something far worse. By Sunday morning, the story was everywhere. Local newspapers splashed bold titles. Cruise passenger loses $16,000 in casino, then jumps overboard. Television anchors recited the details with incredulous tones, as if they could not believe it themselves. On social media, the memes spread faster than the waves. Images of gamblers sinking with captions like "The house always wins" went viral overnight. In Puerto Rico, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, curious to glimpse the man who had turned a luxury cruise into a federal case. Cameras clicked, microphones stretched forward. Jay's name was now tied not to leisure or travel, but to desperation and crime. People across the country argued about the story. Some pitied him, saying gambling addiction had broken him and that he needed help, not prison. Others mocked him, calling him foolish for trying to swim away from debt with a pouch of cash. Cruise passengers who had been on the ship shared their stories online. One wrote, "I saw him at the tables. He was winning big at first, then it all collapsed. The man looked like he was carrying the world on his shoulders." Another posted, "I never thought I'd see someone leap off a cruise ship for money." Everyone had an opinion. Few saw the human being behind the headlines. Inside the courtroom, Jay stood in front of a federal judge. He was no longer a passenger or a gambler. He was a defendant. The charge was clear: failing to report the transport of monetary instruments over $10,000 into the United States. The pouch of $14,600 sat in a clear plastic bag on the evidence table, a haunting reminder of how fast fortune could turn into disaster. When asked to speak, Jay's voice was low. "I did not want to break the law. I only thought they would take it." I was scared his words barely carried through the room. The judge remained stern. Fear was no defense. The law did not care about fear. Back in his cell, Jay sat on a metal bunk staring at the concrete wall. His hands trembled as he replayed the events over and over. The casino lights, the spinning wheel, the flashing cards, the cheers when he won, the silence when he lost, the salt water crashing around him as he clutched the pouch. He realized how quickly excitement had turned to ruin. He had boarded the cruise dreaming of riches. He had disembarked in chains. Outside, the world kept moving. The cruise sailed on to its next port. The passengers ordered cocktails, laughed at shows, and carried home their vacation stories. But for Jay, the trip would forever be remembered as the gamble that cost him everything. The lesson was bitter and clear. Gambling promises dreams, but more often it delivers nightmares. Jay had chased fortune until he had nothing left but fear. He thought the sea might save him. Instead, it revealed him. The story spread as a cautionary tale. Parents told it to children, friends told it in bars, gamblers whispered it across poker tables. Everyone remembered the man who lost $16,000, jumped into the ocean, and was caught with $14,000 strapped to his chest. In the end, the casino had taken his money, the sea had nearly taken his life, and the law had taken his freedom. The house always wins, and when desperation drowns reason, even the ocean cannot hide the truth. This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what's your most unbelievable story? I'll read out the funniest ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you.
An investor flew to Nepal to hear a pitch from a young tech team. Days later, he was hiding in a co-working space as riots burned through the city. Against all odds, he came out with a signed deal and a legendary story. John had flown out of San Francisco with a briefcase full of documents and a head full of numbers. He was a venture investor, the kind of man used to clean offices, polish presentations, and espresso bars in Silicon Valley. But this time his destination was not New York, London, or Berlin. It was Nepal. Kathmandu awaited him, a city of contrasts, ancient temples rising beside tangled streets filled with motorcycles and honking taxis. As the plane descended through the Himalayas, he pressed his forehead against the window. Snow-capped peaks stabbed the sky, glowing orange under the morning sun. For a moment, he forgot the spreadsheets and forecasts. He was humbled, small, entering a place older than any market report he had ever studied. After clearing customs, John stepped outside and was swallowed by the chaos of Kathmandu. The air was thick with spice and dust. Rickshaw drivers shouted for passengers. Motorcycles darted through gaps in traffic, and street vendors waved trays of fried momos and steaming tea. Colorful prayer flags fluttered overhead like signals from another world. He rode in a small taxi through the mall, the bustling heart of the city. Backpackers lugged gear toward hostels. Merchants sold brass statues of Buddha, and shopkeepers argued loudly in Nepali, their voices mixing with Bollywood songs blasting from corner speakers. To John, it was overwhelming, but it was also alive, pulsing with energy. He smiled to himself. This is where the future will be built, he thought. Not in glass towers, but in places that never slept. John's purpose was clear. He had come to meet a young team of engineers who were building a mobile payments platform designed for South Asia. It was scrappy, unpolished, but full of promise. He had reviewed their pitch deck in San Francisco, impressed by their numbers and their courage. They were asking for a chance to scale, and he wanted to be the one to back them. He imagined the meeting the next day. Handshakes, slides projected on a wall, long conversations about scaling servers, raising Series A rounds, and penetrating rural markets. For him, this was familiar territory. Risk and reward were his everyday language. What he did not know was that Nepal's streets were simmering with a different kind of risk, one that no financial model could ever calculate. That evening, he checked into a modest hotel tucked between narrow alleys. The lobby smelled of incense, and the manager greeted him with a warm smile. He unpacked his laptop, spread papers across the desk, and rehearsed questions he would ask the founders. Outside his window, he heard temple bells ringing and street dogs barking at the night. For John, it felt almost like a retreat. He was far from the noise of Wall Street and the competition of Silicon Valley. Here, he imagined, he could find clarity, maybe even purpose. But in the distance, beyond the laughter of tourists and the clatter of dishes from street kitchens, a different sound echoed faintly. Shouts, drums, the voice of a crowd that was growing louder each day. As John drifted to sleep, he could not shake a strange unease. The streets felt restless, like a city holding its breath. He reminded himself he was here for business, not politics. He closed his eyes, thinking of balance sheets and valuations. But outside, posters of politicians burned quietly in alleyways. Youth groups marched at night, carrying banners calling for change. Anger brewed in the city's veins, ready to burst. John's trip to Nepal had begun like any other business journey. Yet, within 24 hours, he would find himself not just an investor, but a witness trapped in the middle of history as a government collapsed around him. The next morning, the air of Kathmandu was sharp and cool, filled with the scent of burning incense from temple courtyards. John left his hotel with a leather bag over his shoulder and documents tucked neatly inside. He walked along streets where vendors pushed carts of vegetables, students hurried to school in pressed uniforms, and taxi drivers leaned on horns as if the city ran on noise. He reached a glass-fronted building, the co-working space where the meeting was scheduled. Inside, the hum of laptops and quiet chatter filled the air. Posters of startups lined the walls, coffee machines hissed, and local entrepreneurs leaned over tables scribbling ideas on whiteboards. For John, it felt familiar, almost like stepping back into Silicon Valley, except with prayer wheels and the faint aroma of masala tea lingering in the air. A young man approached, smiling with a mix of confidence and nerves. This was Arjun, the founder of the mobile payments startup. He wore jeans, a simple button-down shirt, and carried the energy of someone who had been waiting his whole life for this moment. He shook John's hand firmly and said, "Welcome to Nepal. Let me show you what we are building." They walked into a small meeting room where the team had already gathered. Laptops were open, cables stretched across the table, and slides flickered on a screen. The presentation began. Charts of growth, demos of the app, and stories about rural families using mobile payments to avoid carrying cash. The numbers were rough, but the vision was clear. John leaned in, scribbling notes, nodding at the ambition. As Arjun spoke passionately about scaling their service, John noticed something faint outside, the muffled sound of chanting. At first, it seemed like a festival parade, common in Kathmandu's vibrant streets. But as the minutes passed, the voices grew louder, sharper, more rhythmic. The team tried to ignore it. They adjusted slides, handed John papers, and kept the pitch going. But every so often, heads turned toward the window. Shadows moved outside. A group of young men carrying banners marched down the street, their voices echoing against the walls of the co-working building. John shifted uneasily in his chair. He had seen protests before in San Francisco, but this felt different. The energy outside was not celebratory. It was raw, angry, demanding. Suddenly, a crash rang out in the distance. It sounded like glass breaking, followed by the roar of a crowd. Everyone in the room froze. Arjun's voice trailed off mid-sentence. The lights flickered as if the building itself felt the tension. Phones buzzed with alerts. Messages in Nepali scrolled across screens, filled with words John could not understand, but he read the fear in the faces around him. One team member muttered, "It has started." Another pulled down the blinds quickly, leaving the room bathed in artificial light. The chants outside rose to a deafening roar. John looked at Arjun, confused. "What is happening?" Arjun's jaw tightened. "The parliament is under siege. The youth are in the streets. We need to stay inside." The meeting, once filled with numbers and projections, had turned into silence. Everyone listened as the crowd outside grew louder. The air smelled faintly of smoke creeping through the cracks in the window. Somewhere down the street, police sirens wailed. The startup team whispered among themselves, while John sat still, heart pounding. He had flown to Nepal for a pitch meeting, but now he was in the middle of a city on the brink. The presentation slides still glowed on the screen, graphs of growth and opportunity. Yet no one looked at them. All eyes were on the windows, where shadows of people ran by, and the sound of revolution shook the walls. The deal would have to wait. For now, survival was the only agenda. The muffled chanting outside turned into a deafening roar. John pressed himself closer to the window and saw smoke curling into the sky. Down the street, flames licked upward from burning tires. Crowds surged in every direction, their fists pumping, their voices booming in unison. What had begun as a protest was now a riot. From the co-working space balcony, he could see people throwing stones at police lines. Shields clashed, batons swung, and young men scattered only to regroup and charge again. The air outside shimmered with heat, smoke, and the bitter tang of tear gas drifting upward. Inside, the team slammed the doors shut and dragged chairs against them. The building was suddenly not a workplace, but a shelter. News alerts flashed across every phone in the room. Photos showed the parliament building a few blocks away engulfed in flames. Black smoke rose like a signal of collapse. The government had crumbled in hours. Ministers were fleeing through side streets, convoys of officials trapped by furious crowds. One of the developers whispered, "It is over. They burned everything. The government has fallen." His voice trembled as if he could not believe his own words. John sat frozen, his pen still in his hand from the meeting that had ended minutes ago. He had come to talk about investment, about growth charts and funding rounds. But outside, a country's entire system was collapsing before his eyes. The co-working staff moved quickly, lowering shutters, switching off most of the lights, and telling everyone to stay away from the windows. They whispered instructions in Nepali, passing around bottles of water, pushing couches against glass doors. John felt his chest tighten. He was thousands of miles from home, a foreigner in the middle of chaos. He checked his phone, but messages from outside offered no comfort. Airports were closed. Roads were blocked. The city was on fire, and he was trapped in a building that had become a bunker. The startup founder, Arjun, looked at him with calm determination. "We wait. We cannot go outside now. It is too dangerous." The city roared like a living beast. John heard explosions echoed down the streets, followed by screams, then chants rising again. Glass shattered somewhere nearby. A group of rioters rushed past the building, their faces covered with cloth, carrying banners that demanded change. Their feet pounded like drums of war against the pavement. From the stairwell, a group of young entrepreneurs whispered prayers, clutching their laptops like shields. Some called their families, their voices breaking as they promised they were safe. Others sat in silence, staring blankly at the glowing news feeds that showed the same chaos happening all over the city. The co-working space, once a hub of dreams and ideas, was now a fortress of fear. John leaned back against the wall, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could not believe how fast the world had changed. Yesterday, he was planning an investment. Today, he was locked inside a building in a foreign city as a government collapsed outside. The pitch deck still sat open on the projector screen, graphs of revenue growth and expansion targets glowing quietly, forgotten in the corner. The contrast was absurd. Numbers about the future sat on the wall, while the present was being ripped apart in fire and fury. The streets outside shook with the force of change. Inside, John realized he was no longer just a visitor or an investor. He was a witness, a participant in history unfolding in real time. And survival, not finance, was now his priority. As darkness fell over Kathmandu, the streets did not quiet down. The glow of fire replaced daylight. The chants of the crowd became harsher, punctuated by bursts of glass shattering and sirens wailing. From the co-working windows, the world outside looked like a scene from a revolution. Inside, the team gathered in a circle. The power flickered and died, leaving only the soft glow of laptop screens and the faint light from candles scavenged from the break room. The building, once buzzing with startup energy, felt like a safe house under siege. John sat among them, listening to the whispers in Nepali, catching only fragments of meaning. Fear was universal, though. Everyone's eyes darted to the windows. Everyone's shoulders jumped at the sound of explosions in the distance. By the second day, the co-working space no longer resembled an office. Desks had been pushed together to make sleeping platforms. Beanbags became beds. A closet full of instant noodles, biscuits, and bottled water became the pantry. One corner of the room was turned into a charging station where laptops and phones were rationed like supplies in a bunker. The staff taped cardboard over glass doors to block the glow of lights from inside. No one wanted to draw attention. Outside, young men still roamed the streets, shouting, breaking windows, setting fire to whatever symbolized the government. John found himself carrying water jugs, helping tape the windows, sharing food. For the first time in his career, he was not the investor with the upper hand. He was just another human being trapped in the same storm. On the third night, with the power out again, the team gathered on the floor around flickering candles. They shared stories to distract themselves from the chaos outside. One developer spoke about growing up in a small mountain village where electricity arrived only 10 years ago. Another talked about losing a cousin in protests years earlier. The founder, Arjun, told John about his vision: to build something that gave ordinary people control of their money, free from corrupt systems and unstable governments. John listened quietly. He had invested in dozens of companies, but never had he felt this level of conviction. These people were not pitching numbers anymore. They were living the reality that made their technology necessary. At times, silence would fall, and everyone froze. Outside, footsteps thundered past the building, followed by angry voices and smashing sounds. Once, a group tried to break into a shop next door, their shouts echoing through the co-working walls. John's heart raced as he gripped the edge of the desk he was sitting on, waiting for the sound of boots to kick down their door. But the group moved on. The building remained untouched. Relief came in waves, but sleep was impossible. Each sound from outside felt like it could be the end. John realized he was no longer simply hiding from protests. He was hiding from a revolution. Finally, on the fourth morning, the sounds outside changed. The shouts were fewer. The fires no longer burned so brightly. Through the cracks in the blinds, John saw soldiers moving cautiously down the streets, their boots echoing in empty alleys. Shops were reopening one by one. The smoke that had hung heavy in the air began to lift, leaving behind only the smell of ash. Inside, the team exhaled for the first time in days. The co-working space was a mess of blankets, empty noodle cups, and tired faces, but it had become a place of survival. John looked at Arjun, exhausted but resolute. They had gone through fire together, literally and figuratively. And something inside John shifted. This was no longer just an investment. It was personal. He wanted to back not just a company, but the people who had stood with him when the world outside collapsed. When the city finally calmed, John and the team unlatched the co-working doors. A pale morning sun lit the streets, revealing a Kathmandu transformed. The Parliament building was a blackened shell. Smoke still drifted from piles of ash where tires had burned for days. Windows along the main roads were shattered, storefronts looted, walls scarred with slogans in bold red paint. The silence was eerie, broken only by soldiers patrolling and shopkeepers cautiously reopening stalls. Stray dogs wandered between overturned trash bins. The city looked wounded but breathing again. John stepped outside, his clothes wrinkled, his face unshaven, his shoes coated in dust. He inhaled the smoky air and thought, I survived this. Now what comes next is up to me. Back inside the co-working space, the team gathered with renewed purpose. The projector flickered to life again, but this time the charts and growth projections felt different. The numbers were no longer abstract slides. They were survival plans. Arjun stood before John, his voice steady despite exhaustion. You have seen what we lived through. This is why we must build something that works even when everything else collapses. People need a way to hold and send money that no corrupt minister or riot can destroy. John nodded. His notepad lay unopened on the table. He no longer needed to analyze or question. The conviction he saw in their eyes was stronger than any financial model. With the city still smoldering outside, John reached across the table. His hand met Arjun's in a firm grip. I am in, he said simply. The team erupted in relief and cheers. Some clapped, others hugged, and one of the developers wiped away tears. For John, it was the most unconventional deal of his career. No glossy boardroom, no catered lunch, no carefully timed agenda. Just a group of determined founders, a city that had survived collapse, and an investor who had gone through the fire with them. At that moment, the paperwork was secondary. The bond had already been sealed in those dark days of waiting. A week later, flights resumed, and John boarded a plane back to San Francisco. As the aircraft lifted off, he looked down at Kathmandu, the city that had tested him in ways no market ever had. The mountains framed the horizon like ancient guardians, watching silently as he departed. When he landed back in the United States, colleagues and reporters were waiting. Word had spread of his ordeal, how he had been trapped in riots yet still managed to close a deal. Cameras flashed as he walked through the terminal. To many, he looked less like an investor and more like a man who had survived an adventure novel. In the weeks that followed, John's story became legendary in investment circles. Over coffee in Silicon Valley, people whispered, "Did you hear about the guy who closed a deal in Nepal during a government collapse?" His name carried weight not just as a financier, but as someone who had proven resilience under fire. The startup in Nepal began to grow, backed by John's capital and guided by his belief. And John himself returned home not just richer in reputation, but changed in spirit. He realized that the greatest investments are not just about money. They are about people, about courage, and about standing firm when the world shakes around you. He had come to Nepal for a business deal. He returned a hero, a man who endured revolution, believed in a dream, and left with a story no boardroom could ever match. This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what's your most unbelievable story? I'll read out the funniest ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you. Simon Leviev, the so-called Tinder scammer, stole over $10 million by posing as a diamond heir. After years of living in luxury on stolen love, he was finally caught at Batumi Airport. This is the full story of his rise and fall. On Tinder, he looked like a dream come true. His name was Simon Leviev, his smile confident, his clothes tailored, and his backdrop always exotic. Private jets, infinity pools, candlelit dinners in five-star hotels. Every photo screamed wealth and power. Women swiping late at night in London, Paris, New York, and beyond thought they had stumbled across a real-life Prince Charming. The bio sealed the deal. Son of a diamond magnate, heir to an empire, always traveling, looking for someone to share the adventure. It was short, simple, but seductive. A man like that did not just date anyone. To match with him was like winning a golden ticket. The women who matched with Simon quickly realized he was no ordinary man. When he invited them to meet, it was never coffee in a local cafe. Instead, it was dinner at the most exclusive restaurants. A limousine arrived, a driver held the door, and suddenly they were seated at a table where the cheapest bottle of wine cost more than most people's monthly rent. He leaned in close, speaking with a smooth accent and a calm voice. He told them about his father, the legendary Diamond King. He hinted at business meetings, dangerous deals, and international travel. To prove his story, he pulled out his phone and showed photos of him on jets, in luxury hotels, always surrounded by wealth. The women left those first dates feeling like they had been chosen. Not just chosen for romance, but chosen to enter another world. Simon's strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. He gave them a taste of wealth so intoxicating that they began to trust him completely. When he booked last-minute trips, he casually said, "Come with me. I have to be in Rome tonight, or maybe Paris tomorrow." Women found themselves boarding private jets with him, sipping champagne at 30,000 feet, their heads spinning with disbelief. He never acted like a man trying to impress. He acted like a man who already had it all: the money, the contacts, the life of a global billionaire's son. And the scariest part was, everything looked real. The jets were real, the hotels were real, the dinners were real. What the women did not know was that it was all paid for with someone else's sacrifice. He used the title Prince of Diamonds, without ever saying the words outright. It was in the way he dropped details, the way he talked about mines, deals, and enemies in hushed tones. He never begged for trust. He demanded it by painting a picture so vivid that it was impossible to doubt. Every move he made reinforced the fantasy. He sent flowers so large they filled entire rooms. He gifted jewelry boxes with glittering stones. He whisked women away to exotic cities and suites where chandeliers sparkled overhead. Behind every smile, every toast, every lavish gesture was the same hidden truth. The money he spent on one woman came from the desperation of another. The fairy tale was already funded by heartbreak. By the time the first dates ended, the women were hooked. They felt chosen, loved, swept into a whirlwind of romance. Their friends gasped when they showed photos. Their families whispered in envy. Simon had crafted an illusion so strong that it became their reality. But in the shadows, the trap was already set. Every dinner, every flight, every diamond bracelet was bait. The women thought they had met the heir to a diamond fortune. What they had really met was a man building a pyramid of lies, one swipe at a time. The rise of Simon Leviev was not a love story. It was the opening act of one of the strangest scams the world had ever seen. At first, Simon was all about charm. Smiles, dinners, jets, the good life. But once his victims were fully wrapped in his fantasy, the tone shifted. The laughter turned into whispers. The champagne glasses were replaced by late-night phone calls. His texts arrived with urgency, his voice messages filled with tension. He told them the same chilling story. He had enemies, dangerous men who hated him, men who wanted to hurt him and destroy his father's diamond empire. He said they followed him everywhere, that every trip and every flight carried the shadow of danger. For women already swept off their feet, the fear was contagious. If Simon was in danger, then so were they. Protecting him felt like protecting themselves. Simon knew words alone would not be enough. He backed them with theatrics. Late at night, his victims received photos of his bodyguard lying in a hospital bed, covered in bandages, looking as if he had been attacked. There were grainy videos of luxury cars with broken windows, photos of supposed threats, even fake police reports. The effect was powerful. The women gasped, their hearts raced, and their sympathy deepened. They believed the man they loved was being hunted. To doubt him now would mean doubting the luxurious life they had already seen with their own eyes. He sealed the illusion with desperation in his voice. He would call, his tone breaking, saying, "They are after me again. I cannot use my cards. My accounts are frozen. They are watching me. I need your help." This was where the trap closed. Simon never begged outright. He framed it as a temporary lifeline. "Just send me something. I will pay you back the moment I can access my accounts. You know who I am. You have seen my life. I would never leave you in debt." The victims hesitated at first, but the memory of the private jet, the dinners, the gifts, the trips silenced the doubt. This was not some random stranger asking for money. This was the heir to a diamond fortune, the man who had already shown them his world. So they agreed. The first transfers were small. A few thousand here, a few thousand there. But Simon's requests grew bolder. 10,000, 20,000. Some women even took out loans, convinced that saving him now meant securing a future with him. Once the money was wired, Simon's tone flipped again. He thanked them profusely, sending long messages about how they had saved his life. He flooded their phones with "I love you" and "You are my angel," until the women felt reassured. The fear turned into pride. They believed they had done something noble, something heroic. But just as quickly, another crisis would arrive. Another enemy attack, another frozen account, another urgent request. The cycle repeated until the women were financially drained. What made the scam so effective was not the money itself. It was the emotional hook. These women were not just investing cash. They were investing their hearts, their trust, their futures. By the time they realized how deep they were, it was too late. Credit card bills stacked on kitchen tables. Calls from banks piled up. Parents and friends asked questions they could not answer. The women stared at their reflections in mirrors, ashamed, wondering how they had fallen so far. But Simon kept moving, spinning the same tale for the next victim. The story of enemies and danger was his greatest weapon. It trapped women in invisible chains, forged from fear and love, until they were both broke and broken. The Prince of Diamonds had transformed into a master of shadows, and his victims were left paying the price for a battle that never existed. Simon's brilliance, if you could call it that, was in how he kept the machine running. He never needed investors, banks, or business partners. He had a different system. One woman's loan became the down payment for the next woman's fairy tale. Every dinner, every flight, every hotel suite was bought with stolen trust. To the victim in London, her money was saving Simon's life. To the woman in Oslo, the same money became champagne and roses. And to the new match in Stockholm, it was the dazzling illusion of wealth that would hook her in. It was not just a scam. It was a conveyor belt of broken hearts, each fueling the next. Imagine this. Anna from Finland wires him $20,000 to escape danger. That very same week, Simon flies another woman, Christina, to Rome. Christina posts photos with him on Instagram, amazed at his generosity, while Anna is maxing out her credit cards in a panic. The cycle repeated endlessly. Money came in from one desperate victim, went straight out to dazzle the next, and then circled back as new victims fell into debt. It was a financial carousel, spinning faster and faster, leaving chaos in its wake. Every luxury photo on Tinder, every glamorous post, was really a billboard paid for by another woman's shattered finances. By the time journalists and investigators pieced the puzzle together, the scale was staggering. Women across Europe and beyond had lost millions. Some estimates reached over $10 million. One woman pawned family heirlooms. Another took out 5 different bank loans, believing she was rescuing the love of her life. Some victims ended up bankrupt, unable to pay rent, with debt collectors at their doors. The heartbreak was not just emotional. It was financial ruin. And all the while, Simon kept walking through airports with designer luggage, wearing watches worth more than the debt of his victims combined. The strangest part was how untouchable he seemed. He moved across borders with ease, always in a new city, always in luxury hotels. Photos showed him grinning in yachts, lounging in beach clubs, clinking glasses in rooftop bars. And because every step of his journey looked real, women continued to believe the lie. After all, how could a man surrounded by so much wealth possibly be faking it? He even bragged openly online, posting videos of himself in penthouses, acting like nothing could touch him. The illusion became stronger than the truth. Even when cracks appeared, victims silenced their doubts, convinced that love and fortune were just around the corner. But pyramids are heavy structures, and eventually, even the strongest facade begins to wobble. Women started to talk. Stories overlapped. Bank officers raised red flags. Journalists received tips. A Netflix documentary team began digging into the layers of lies. The cracks widened as victims realized they were not alone. They were part of something much bigger, a global web of deceit. Simon thought his empire of trust could last forever, but the same machine that kept him afloat was now pulling him down. For every woman he fooled, another began to see through the mask. The Prince of Diamonds was standing on a pyramid of broken promises, and the base was starting to collapse. After years of scamming across Europe, Simon acted like a man shielded by invincibility. The Netflix documentary had already made him infamous, yet he still strolled through airports, still stayed in luxury hotels, still posed with champagne glasses like nothing had changed. He thought he was clever enough to stay one step ahead. He used fake names, forged passports, and constantly changed cities. To him, airports were not dangerous checkpoints. They were runways for his ego. Each stamp in his passport was proof that he was still untouchable. But arrogance blinds even the most careful con. It was an ordinary afternoon at Batumi International Airport in Georgia. Families lined up with suitcases, tourists returned from beach vacations, and the buzz of announcements echoed through the terminal. Simon Leviev walked in with his usual swagger, pulling sleek luggage, dressed sharply, with expensive sunglasses covering his eyes. He approached the border control desk like he had done 100 times before. His forged passport slid across the counter with practiced ease. He flashed his trademark smile, the same smile that had seduced so many victims. But this time, the smile did not work. The officer scanned the passport. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen blinked red. His name lit up. Simon Leviev, wanted internationally. A man flagged for fraud, for theft, for deception across multiple countries. The officer looked up slowly, eyes narrowing. Simon tried to keep his composure, but a flicker of panic crossed his face. He straightened his jacket, adjusted his sunglasses, and muttered something about business travel. It did not matter. Uniformed officers were already on the move. Two stepped up from behind, another blocked the exit. Passengers nearby whispered in disbelief, recognizing the man from headlines and memes. Phones came out. Cameras clicked. The Tinder swindler, the so-called Prince of Diamonds, was caught in the most ordinary of traps, a routine passport check. The officers grabbed his arms firmly, pulling them behind his back as the handcuffs snapped shut. The metallic sound echoed across the terminal, louder than the airport announcements. Simon raised his voice, trying to charm or argue his way out. He insisted it was a mistake, demanded to call his contacts, claimed he had powerful friends. But the officers were unmoved. They had seen his file. They knew exactly who he was. The once untouchable scammer, who had flown on private jets and dined under crystal chandeliers, was now being walked through an airport corridor in handcuffs. His sunglasses hung crooked, his hair was damp with sweat, and for the first time in years, he looked small. News spread within hours. Photos of him in custody flashed across screens worldwide. Social media lit up with cheers, jokes, and disbelief. Victims who had lost everything cried when they saw him in chains. Some felt justice, others only a hollow reminder that their money was gone forever. The irony was impossible to ignore. After years of elaborate lies, fake documents, and an empire of deception, Simon Leviev was not taken down by a brilliant sting operation or a daring chase. He was undone by the simplest of things, a border officer doing his job. For Simon, the game was over. The mask had finally slipped, and the world had seen the man behind it. By the next morning, the arrest was everywhere. Headlines screamed across every continent. The Tinder scammer caught in Batumi Airport. News anchors delivered the story with a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. On social media, his mugshot spread faster than his fake Tinder profile ever had. Memes exploded. Some showed him in handcuffs captioned, "Your enemies caught you this time." Others mocked his infamous line about frozen accounts. For years he had lived like a ghost, charming his way past suspicion. Now he was nothing more than a cautionary tale splashed across trending hashtags. For the women he had deceived, the news hit like a tidal wave. Some wept with relief, finally seeing the man who had drained their savings face justice. One victim told reporters, "I lost everything, but at least the world now knows who he really is." Another admitted, "It does not bring back my money, but it brings back some of my dignity." But not all felt closure. Many victims were still drowning in debt. Collectors still knocked at their doors. Families still questioned their judgment. For them, Simon's arrest was only a partial victory. The scars he left were deeper than any prison sentence could erase. When Simon finally appeared in court, the illusion was gone. The man once dressed in designer suits now stood in a plain prison uniform. His head was bowed, his hands cuffed. The same judges and lawyers who had seen his case on Netflix now had him standing in front of them. The prosecution laid out the scale of his crimes. Over $10 million stolen through romance fraud. Dozens of victims across multiple countries. Years of manipulation, forged documents, and psychological warfare. The court became a stage where his empire of lies was dismantled piece by piece. Simon tried to speak, still clinging to his old performance. He insisted he had been misunderstood, that his wealth was real, that he had done nothing illegal. But the charm was gone. No one was buying the act anymore. Outside the courtroom, the debate raged. Some argued he should serve decades in prison. Others marveled at how long he had managed to run free. There were even those who bizarrely admired his audacity, calling him a criminal genius or the boldest scammer of our time. But the overwhelming consensus was clear. Simon Leviev had built his empire on lies and stolen trust, and now it had collapsed under the weight of his arrogance. The Prince of Diamonds was nothing more than a common fraud. For the public, his story became entertainment. For his victims, it remained a lifelong wound. As Simon sat in his cell, the irony was sharp. He had flown on private jets, slept in penthouses, eaten at the finest tables. Yet every dollar had come from someone else's pocket, someone else's heart. He thought he was building a kingdom. Instead, he built a house of cards. And the truth about houses of cards is simple. They always fall. The world was reminded of one bitter lesson. Love can blind even the smartest people. Trust can be weaponized, and a charming smile can cost millions. Simon Leviev once promised women the world. All he gave them was debt and heartbreak. Now his name stands forever as a warning. Every scam, no matter how elaborate, eventually runs out of time. This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what's your most unbelievable story? I'll read out the funniest ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you. Top economist Mark Zandi has issued his starkest warning yet. The U.S. economy faces a 48% chance of recession in the next year. From collapsing housing permits to a fragile Federal Reserve decision, here's the full story of why the cliff's edge feels closer than ever. Mark Zandi was no stranger to economic headlines. As the chief economist of Moody's Analytics, his name appeared often in newspapers, reports, and on television. But there was something different in his tone this time. It was sharper, more urgent. He was not just analyzing data, he was issuing a warning. When he told an interviewer the United States economy was on the precipice of recession, the phrase landed like a thunderclap. Traders, policymakers, and journalists all leaned closer. If Zandi was worried, they knew it was serious. The timing of his words mattered. Inflation had rattled households. Interest rates were at levels not seen in years, and consumer confidence was fragile. Every grocery bill, every car loan, every mortgage payment felt heavier to ordinary families. Businesses were cutting back on hiring, and whispers of layoffs crept through corporate corridors. It was an uneasy calm, like a city waiting for a storm. In that climate, Zandi's phrase, edge of a cliff, did not sound like exaggeration. It felt like the truth many people were already sensing but had not yet spoken aloud. Zandi had built a reputation on calling risks before they became obvious. During the financial crisis of 2008, he was one of the analysts who warned about the dangers of the housing bubble when others were still optimistic. That memory gave his words even more weight now. When he spoke of danger, the world remembered that he had been right before. So when he described recession odds as uncomfortably high, people did not brush it off as noise. The phrase spread across financial television, headlines, and social media feeds. Everyone wanted to know, what made him so alarmed this time? Investors reacted quickly. Some shifted portfolios toward safer assets. Gold ticked upward, bond yields flickered, and cautious voices began to dominate trading floors. But outside Wall Street, the effect was just as powerful. At kitchen tables across America, families talked about job security and shrinking savings. For workers who had lived through 2008, the echoes were unmistakable. The tension was not just about numbers. It was about trust. If the man at Moody's was warning of a cliff, how long could the economy balance there before slipping? At that moment, no collapse had happened yet. The markets were still open, the lights were still on, and business continued. But Zandi's words hung in the air like a shadow over everything else. He had pointed at the cliff's edge and said the nation was too close for comfort. Few knew exactly what the next weeks or months would bring, but everyone felt it. The uneasy silence before a storm, the weight of a warning that could not be ignored. The alarm bell had been rung, and the sound was echoing through boardrooms, factories, and households alike. When Mark Zandi explained why he was so alarmed, he pointed not to Wall Street or stock tickers, but to something quieter, building permits. To most people, permits sound dull, a bureaucratic detail buried in paperwork. But to economists, they are one of the most reliable signals of what comes next. When builders stop asking for permits, it means they are pulling back on future projects. And when construction slows, it ripples across the economy. Fewer jobs, fewer materials ordered, less demand for furniture, appliances, and cars. Zandy held up the numbers. They were not just slipping. They were falling fast, approaching lows not seen since the pandemic lockdowns. Behind those numbers were stories of hesitation. Across the country, developers were halting projects mid-plan. Empty lots sat fenced off, with bulldozers idle. Buyers were vanishing, spooked by high mortgage rates and rising costs. Realtors reported open houses with no visitors. Builders who once rushed to pour foundations now sat on the sidelines, afraid of being stuck with homes nobody wanted. Zandy described it as a freeze. Supply and demand were locked in a standoff. Unsold homes stacked up like dominoes waiting to fall. The imbalance signaled that confidence, the lifeblood of the housing market, was evaporating. For Zandy, the housing signal was haunting. He reminded people that housing downturns had preceded almost every modern recession. The Great Recession of 2008 was the most brutal example, triggered by a housing bubble bursting. While today's situation was not identical, the pattern was too familiar to ignore. He pointed to charts showing past cycles. Each time building permits collapsed, a recession followed within months. The economy is fragile, he said. When housing slows like this, history is clear about what comes next. The warning was not just academic. It was a reminder of pain people still carried from crises past. What made the moment even more tense was timing. The new housing permit data was being released just days before the Federal Reserve's meeting. Analysts knew that policymakers would see the same red flags Zandy was describing. The debate was no longer abstract. The numbers would force the Fed's hand, and the world was waiting to see how they would respond. Investors circled dates on calendars. Journalists wrote that Wednesday's report could make or break the markets. Zandy predicted openly that the Fed would have to cut rates. But even he admitted, grimly, that it might not be enough. For families outside the financial world, the news filtered down in simpler terms. Headlines screamed about permits collapsing, buyers disappearing, and economists warning of recession. People driving past half-finished housing projects felt a pit in their stomach. If homes were not selling, what did that say about the broader economy? For investors, the data felt like a flashing red light on the dashboard of a car speeding downhill. You could not ignore it. For workers, it felt like a quiet signal that jobs might be next. For Zandy, it was confirmation of what he had already sensed. The United States was moving closer to the cliff's edge, and the ground beneath it was cracking. On a quiet weekend, Mark Zandy opened his account on X and posted a figure that would ripple across the financial world. He wrote that the chance of a United States recession within the next 12 months was 48%. It was not a prediction of certainty, but the number was high enough to send chills. For context, recession probabilities rarely rise above 30%, even in uneasy times. 48 was not just unusual, it was historic. He added something darker. Never before had the probability reached that level without a recession following soon after. It was not quite half, but it was close enough to feel inevitable. Analysts compared the number to a coin flip. Imagine tossing a quarter in the air with nearly even odds that it lands on recession. It did not matter that the technical number was less than 50. Psychologically, it felt like a line had been crossed. Investors hate uncertainty, and Zandy had just declared that the next year was essentially a gamble with enormous stakes. Television anchors repeated the statistic. Newspapers put it in bold headlines. The words "uncomfortably high" trended across financial Twitter. Everyone was asking the same question. Was this the final warning before the fall? On Monday morning, traders arrived to buzzing screens. Futures dipped, bonds rallied, and gold ticked upward as investors rushed towards safety. Hedge funds debated strategies behind closed doors. Some believed Zandy was being cautious, but others quietly rebalanced portfolios. They had seen enough downturns to know that ignoring signals could be fatal. Financial television played his interview clips in loops, showing him warning again that the economy was at the edge of a cliff. Markets listened because he had credibility. The number 48% carried the weight of years of data and a man known for not exaggerating. The impact went beyond investors. At dinner tables across America, the statistic filtered into conversations. A mother in Ohio asked her husband if they should delay buying a new car. A worker in Texas wondered if his company would freeze hiring. Families remembered 2008 and feared losing jobs or homes again. For ordinary people, Zandy's words turned into an unease that hung over daily life. Even those who did not follow economics directly could feel the anxiety. News segments broke down the number in simple language. 48% was not abstract. It meant almost 1 in 2 chances of economic pain arriving soon. For Zandy, it was about honesty. He wanted people to see the risk clearly before it was too late. But his statement also had an unintended effect. By warning so strongly, he may have deepened the very fear that could trigger the downturn. Confidence drives economies, and once shaken, it can spiral quickly. The number lingered like a storm forecast that everyone checks, but no one can stop. Markets knew it. Families knew it. Policymakers knew it. 48% was not just a figure in a report. It was a line in the sand, a warning that history rarely ignored. As the week unfolded, Zandy's warning became the backdrop to a bigger event. The Federal Reserve was scheduled to meet. For months, the Fed had been raising interest rates to fight inflation. But higher borrowing costs were already choking the housing market and squeezing businesses. Now, with building permits collapsing and Zandy's 48% warning echoing through the headlines, the stakes were higher than ever. Investors, bankers, and politicians all asked the same question. Would the Fed cut rates? Could they act quickly enough to stop the slide, or would they hesitate and push the economy over the edge? The Fed was trapped between two dangers. Cutting rates could calm markets and give businesses breathing room. But cutting too soon could reignite inflation, undoing months of painful progress. Keeping rates high, on the other hand, could crush demand further, turning a slowdown into a full-blown recession. Economists called it a no-win scenario. Whatever choice they made would carry risks. Zandy weighed in publicly, saying the Fed had no choice but to cut, but warning at the same time that even a cut might not be enough. His words spread across television banners. Rate cut cannot stop recession. The tension built as Wednesday approached. Financial journalists compared it to waiting for a verdict in a trial. Stock markets held their breath. Analysts dissected every phrase from Fed officials and past speeches, looking for clues. Ordinary people who rarely paid attention to interest rates suddenly found themselves curious. Homeowners wondered if mortgages would ease. Students questioned what would happen to loan rates. Small business owners checked their bank accounts nervously, wondering if credit would stay affordable or dry up entirely. The entire nation was waiting for the same group of officials in Washington to speak a few words that could ripple across every household. On Wall Street, traders crowded in front of screens, watching futures swing wildly with every rumor. Some funds quietly bought gold and bonds, hedging for safety. Others gambled on stocks bouncing back if the Fed cut aggressively. In interviews, Zandy kept repeating his grim message. Even if they cut, the fundamentals are weakening. Housing is flashing red. Confidence is draining. The Fed can ease the pain, but they cannot erase the problem. His voice carried the same mix of authority and doom, reinforcing the sense that the country was running out of time. The night before the announcement, newsrooms buzzed. Television anchors promised live coverage of the Fed decision. Newspapers prepared headlines for both scenarios: Fed cuts to avoid recession, or Fed holds steady as risks rise. It felt like history was about to pivot on a single moment. For the millions of people watching, it was not just about markets. It was about jobs, paychecks, and savings. For Zandy, the message was clear. Whatever the Fed decided, the risk of recession was already uncomfortably high. The country was not waiting for the storm to begin. The storm had already started. As markets opened the next day, the mood was fragile. Traders stared at screens that flickered between red and green, each shift carrying the weight of billions of dollars. The nation was waiting for the Fed's announcement, but the real tension was psychological. People were already acting as if recession had arrived. Businesses delayed expansions. Families postponed car purchases and vacations. Investors clutched at safe assets. Zandy's number, 48%, echoed like a drumbeat. Not certain, not inevitable, but close enough to make every choice feel dangerous. Across the country, small signs of slowdown appeared. A factory in Michigan quietly trimmed shifts. A tech company in California announced a hiring freeze. A retailer in New York hinted at cutting staff hours. None of these made national headlines, but together they formed a chilling pattern. Workers whispered nervously in break rooms, asking if their company would be next. For many, the economy was no longer an abstract concept. It was personal, tied to paychecks and bills. The sense of walking on a tightrope grew heavier each day. When the Federal Reserve finally made its announcement, the world leaned in. The Fed opted for a modest rate cut, signaling they were aware of the risks but unwilling to fully abandon their inflation fight. For a moment, markets surged in relief, then dipped again as investors realized what Zandy had warned. A cut might soften the blow, but it would not erase the danger. Commentators filled the airwaves with debates. Was the Fed too cautious or too late? Everyone seemed to agree on one thing. The cliff edge had not moved. America was still standing on it. On social media, the public conversation shifted into fear and sarcasm. Memes about flipping a coin for recession spread widely. Hashtags like #RecessionWatch trended. At coffee shops, people debated whether to refinance mortgages or hold cash. College graduates worried about entering a job market that could collapse at any moment. The economy was not yet in recession, but the mood felt as if it already was. Fear itself was becoming a force, shaping behavior in ways that could accelerate the downer. Zandy's words lingered as a final warning. The probability has never reached this level without a recession following. It was not a prophecy, but it was a fact, rooted in history. Families, investors, and leaders all carried it with them as they looked to the months ahead. The United States had not fallen yet, but it was leaning dangerously forward. Every new data release, every market shift, every company report would feel like a gust of wind. The cliff's edge was beneath everyone's feet, and the question remained unanswered. Would this time be different, or would history once again prove that the fall was unavoidable? This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what's your most unbelievable story? I'll read out the funniest ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you.
The town in Utah looked like it was thriving. Streets were lined with brand new houses, shiny cars in driveways, fresh paint on every porch. Construction sites buzzed with activity, and signs advertising new developments were planted in the dirt. The people spoke of growth, jobs, and opportunity. And at the heart of it all was one man, Mike. To most citizens, Mike was the face of progress. He wore expensive suits, drove black SUVs, and shook hands with mayors and bankers. He was called an investor, a visionary, the man who put their city on the map. But beneath that polished surface, whispers spread. Mike's story was never simple. Years ago, before the suits and the skyscraper offices, he was tied to men the city preferred not to mention. Gangsters, enforcers, names whispered only in bars late at night. People said Mike had been their partner, running money and cutting deals in dark alleys long before he became the big boss. Now those whispers followed him like shadows. No one dared confront him directly. Everyone knew that power and silence walked hand in hand. If you wanted a job, you smiled at Mike. If you wanted to keep your business, you did not ask questions about his past. But not everyone stayed silent. Charlie, a young journalist and activist, was the voice that refused to be quiet. He wrote for the local paper, and more importantly, he ran a social media account that thousands followed. His posts were blunt, his words sharp. Mike built his empire on blood, Charlie wrote in one article. The homes you live in stand on money washed clean of crime. Some called him a hero for daring to expose the truth. Others called him reckless, saying he was poking a lion with a stick. Charlie did not care. He believed that if people knew who Mike really was, they would stop treating him like a savior. The city grew restless. Every new article Charlie published drew bigger crowds online. Every whisper about Mike's past became louder. At cafes, people argued over their coffee. Was Mike a criminal or just a businessman who had moved on from mistakes? Was Charlie a brave truth-teller or an attention seeker chasing headlines? The mayor announced a town hall meeting, a place where citizens could ask questions about the city's future. No one expected fireworks, but everyone knew that if Mike and Charlie showed up in the same room, sparks would fly. That evening, the town hall filled with people. Folding chairs lined the floor, and the smell of dust and old wood filled the air. Local reporters set up cameras in the back. Neighbors whispered to one another, glancing at the entrance every time the doors creaked. Charlie arrived first, carrying a worn leather notebook under his arm. He looked calm, but his eyes burned with determination. He was ready to speak the words he had already printed for months. Then the doors opened again. Mike stepped in. His suit was sharp, his watch gleamed, his steps were slow and deliberate. Every head in the room turned toward him. Some clapped, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The air tightened. Two men, one with power, one with words. And the town was about to witness the clash. The mayor tapped the microphone, welcomed the townspeople, and spoke about housing, budgets, and the future of the community. His words were routine, but no one in the room was really listening. Every eye flicked toward Charlie, who sat near the front row with his notebook open. When the floor opened for public comments, Charlie stood. The wood floorboards creaked under his steps as he walked to the podium. He placed his notebook down, cleared his throat, and looked straight at the crowd. "Neighbors, friends," he began, "we live in a city that is growing fast. But growth without truth is nothing. You all celebrate the new homes, the new jobs, and the money flowing in. But do you know where that money came from?" Charlie's voice grew stronger with each sentence. "Mike, the man many of you call a savior is no savior. He is a man who once worked with criminals. He took their money, cleaned it, and built an empire with it. And now he hides in plain sight, calling himself an investor while the truth rots under the surface." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some people leaned forward, nodding. Others shook their heads, muttering that Charlie was going too far. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. Cameras zoomed in on Charlie's face. Charlie slammed his palm on the podium for emphasis. "The people deserve to know who builds their homes. Do you want to live under roofs raised with clean money or blood money?" In the back of the hall, a chair scraped loudly against the floor. Mike stood. His presence filled the room instantly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his tailored suit made him look untouchable. He walked slowly down the aisle, each step echoing against the wood floor. The crowd parted their gazes between him and Charlie, waiting for the collision. Mike stopped only a few feet from the podium. His voice was deep and sharp, cutting through the silence. "You are a liar. Every word you wrote is poison. You smear my name for attention, for your little newspaper, for clicks on your social media. You are not a journalist. You are a coward hiding behind words." The crowd roared. Some shouted, "Yes," in support of Mike. Others booed, defending Charlie. The mayor pounded his gavel, yelling for order, but the hall was alive with chaos. Charlie gripped the podium, his eyes locked on Mike. "If I am lying, then prove it. Show the records. Show the deals. Show us how you made your first fortune. If your money is clean, then let the truth shine. But if it is not, the people deserve to know." Mike leaned closer, pointing a finger at him. "You think you can challenge me with rumors and gossip? You think your little words are stronger than everything I built? You know nothing about the sacrifices I made? Nothing." Charlie's voice rang out clear. "The only thing I know is this: power without accountability is corruption. And I will not stop until people see the man behind the mask." The town hall erupted. One side of the room clapped loudly for Charlie, shouting words like truth and justice. The other side cheered for Mike, yelling that Charlie was jealous, reckless, and dangerous. The mayor's gavel slammed again and again, but the sound drowned in the storm of voices. At the front, two men stood locked in a battle of stares. Mike, the big boss who ruled the city with money and influence. Charlie, the journalist armed only with his words. The confrontation had begun, and the city had chosen sides. Mike stepped even closer to the podium, his shadow looming over Charlie. His voice thundered across the hall. "You write stories, but you have no proof. You poison this town with lies, dragging my name through the mud because you cannot stand the success of others. I built this city with my own hands, with sweat, with risk. You sit at a desk and call me a criminal. Who do you think the people will believe?" A section of the crowd cheered loudly, clapping and shouting, "That's right, Mike!" Others shook their heads, hissing back, "Answer the question!" Charlie stood firm. He raised his notebook high in the air. "Proof? I have interviews, records, names. People who worked with you before you wore your shiny suits. They told me what you did. They told me how you made your first fortune. And if you want me to, I will print every single word tomorrow." Gasps spread through the hall. The reporters leaned forward eagerly, their cameras flashing. Charlie's voice grew sharper, cutting through the noise. You think your wealth makes you untouchable? You think because you donate to charities and shake hands with politicians, no one will ask questions. But this town is not blind anymore. They see the truth. The homes you build are not just foundations and walls. They are monuments built on fear and silence. The room buzzed. People argued openly in the crowd. One woman shouted, "We need housing. We don't care where the money came from." Another man yelled back, "We will not let blood money run this city." The mayor's gavel slammed again, but the hall was out of control. Mike's face twisted with anger. His finger jabbed toward Charlie's chest. You are not a hero. You are a parasite, feeding off attention. Every word you print is a weapon, and one day people will see you for what you really are. A fraud. Charlie pushed the finger away and spoke directly into the microphone. If telling the truth makes me a fraud, then I will wear that label proudly. Because I would rather be hated for speaking the truth than praised for living a lie. Half the hall erupted in applause. The other half booed and shouted insults at Charlie. The room was no longer just an audience, it was a battlefield of voices. Supporters of Mike shouted about jobs, homes, and stability. Supporters of Charlie shouted about justice, accountability, and corruption. The mayor stood helpless, his gavel drowned out by the chaos. Reporters captured every second, sensing that this confrontation was more than a meeting. It was a moment that would define the town. Charlie raised his voice again over the noise. Mike, answer me this. Who were the men you worked with before you called yourself an investor? Where are they now? Do they still walk in the shadows while you smile in the light? The crowd went silent again, waiting for Mike's reply. Mike's eyes narrowed, his voice dropped low, almost like a growl, but the microphones caught every word. You better stop digging, Charlie. Because if you keep dragging my past into the light, you will find yourself in the dark, and once you are there, no one will pull you out. The words sent a chill through the hall. Some people gasped, others murmured nervously. A few shouted angrily at Mike for making a threat in public. Charlie did not flinch. He stared straight into Mike's eyes and said firmly, "Then let the darkness come. Because the truth will always find a way out." The tension in the hall reached its peak. Everyone knew this was no longer just a debate. It was a war. The mayor slammed his gavel again and again, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. People shouted from every corner of the hall. Some demanded that Mike answer the question. Others screamed at Charlie to sit down and stop stirring trouble. A few stood up clapping and chanting for truth. The noise echoed off the old wooden walls, shaking the very air. Reporters leaned over their equipment, capturing every second. Flashbulbs popped like lightning. The town hall was no longer a civic meeting. It was a stage for a public war. Mike lifted his hands, demanding silence. The crowd quieted, not out of respect, but out of fear. His face was carved with fury. Mike's voice cut through the noise like a blade. You keep talking about my past, Charlie. You want to drag it out into the light? Fine, I did things when I was young. I made choices I am not proud of. But without those choices, there would be no houses, no jobs, no future for this city. The room froze. Some people gasped at his admission. Others nodded, saying at least he was being honest. Charlie seized the moment, his words sharp. So you admit it. You built your empire on crime. You used gangsters to rise, and now you dress it up with charity and construction projects. But you cannot buy away the blood that built your foundation. Mike's eyes burned. His jaw clenched tight. He stepped so close to the podium that his breath hit the microphone. You think your words protect you? Mike growled, but words are thin paper. Paper burns, and when it burns, you will stand with nothing but ashes. You want to keep poking into my past, Charlie? Then remember, my friends are not the kind of men who forgive. They do not sit in newspapers. They do not smile for cameras. They do not care about your little speeches. The hall filled with gasps and murmurs. Some shouted, "That's a threat." Others yelled, "He's telling the truth." The mayor shouted for silence, but his voice was weak against the roar. Charlie leaned into the mic, refusing to back down. If your friends still walk in the shadows, then let them come into the light with you. Because the truth will not burn, it will survive you. It will survive your empire, and it will survive whatever threats you throw at me. The crowd split down the middle. One side stood and cheered for Charlie, chanting his name. The other side booed and shouted insults, calling him a liar and a fool. Families argued with each other in the aisles. Old neighbors shouted across rows. The hall looked less like a public meeting and more like a brawl waiting to happen. Reporters shouted questions at Mike, their cameras flashing wildly. Do you deny working with criminals? Are you threatening the press? What do you say to your critics? Mike ignored them all. His eyes never left Charlie. Mike's face softened into a cold smile. He leaned close to the microphone and said, "You should be careful, Charlie. Because when you play with men like me, you are not just risking your job, you are risking your life." The hall exploded. People screamed, some rushing for the doors, others shouting at the stage. The mayor threw down his gavel in frustration, shouting for order, but order was long gone. Charlie did not move. He stared directly at Mike, his voice steady. "Then I will risk it, because this city deserves to know the truth." The cameras caught every second. The town had witnessed the mask slip, and the whole room knew the clash was no longer about words. It was about survival. The town hall was no longer a meeting. It was a battlefield. Shouts filled the room. Some people stormed toward the exits, furious and frightened. Others rushed forward, trying to shout questions at both men. The mayor gave up pounding his gavel, slumped into his chair, and muttered to an aide that the meeting was over. Security guards formed a line between Mike and Charlie, ready in case the clash turned physical. The two men never looked away from each other. Mike's cold smile lingered, while Charlie stood tall at the podium, breathing hard but refusing to step back. Reporters snapped their final photos. The cameras had captured everything. When the doors opened, the crowd spilled into the night air. The streets outside the hall buzzed like a storm. Groups argued loudly under the streetlights. Some chanted Charlie's name, calling him a hero. Others defended Mike, saying his money kept the city alive. Local news vans pulled up, reporters setting up tripods, eager to broadcast the chaos live. People held up phones, recording the crowd, streaming the argument across social media. The whole town was watching, and soon the whole state would be. Mike left the hall first, surrounded by his bodyguards. His SUV door slammed shut, and the vehicle rolled away slowly, headlights cutting through the mob. Charlie walked out later, surrounded not by guards, but by supporters who clapped his shoulders and told him to keep going. Back in his small apartment, Charlie sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. His phone buzzed nonstop. Notifications from social media, calls from reporters, messages from strangers. Some praised him, others warned him. A few sent threats that made his skin crawl. He opened his notebook, the same one he had carried into the hall, and began to write his next article. His hand trembled, but not from fear, from determination. He wrote, "Tonight, the mask slipped. Power showed its teeth. The people saw what I have been writing for months. This is not just about one man. It is about the kind of city we want to live in." He hit save, knowing the fight was only beginning. Meanwhile, Mike sat alone in his office high above the city. The glass walls reflected the glow of streetlights below. He poured a glass of whiskey, staring at the ice swirling inside. His bodyguard stood silent outside the door, waiting. He whispered to himself, "The kid does not know what he started." His mind drifted to old friends, men who had once done things for him in dark alleys and empty fields. He thought of calling them again, of pulling the past into the present. Then he looked at the city below, the homes rising, the lights glowing in every window. He muttered, "This is mine. I built it. No one will take it from me." The town went to sleep that night buzzing with rumors. Some people dreamed of change, inspired by Charlie's courage. Others feared the storm that might follow Mike's threat. The line was drawn, and the community stood divided. Charlie sat at his desk whispering to himself, "Truth is never safe, but it is always worth it." Mike sat in his office, staring out into the night, whispering, "Power does not bend. It breaks those who challenge it." Two men, one with words, one with power. Their paths had crossed in public, and neither would ever turn back. The clash at City Hall was not the end. It was the beginning of a war for the soul of the city. This is the end of that story. Now tell me in the comments, what was your most embarrassing story? I'll read out the funniest ones in the next video. Do not forget to hit a like button and subscribe. See you.